Back home, and economists around the country were caught by surprise with last week's inflation rate. Inflation has slowed slightly more than anticipated, adding fuel to the argument that the Reserve Bank's move this month boosting up the official cash rate was too much. Well, Infometrics principal economist Brad Olsen joins us now to talk about this. Good morning, Brad. The economists, did they get it wrong?
Oh, we absolutely got it wrong, and in the right direction in a sense. Economists were picking inflation to come in around that 7.1, 7.2% annual mark. Instead, it pulled back slightly, moderated slightly to 6.7%. That's a much better result. Looking at the details underneath, there's still a lot of caution involved. Part of the driver of that lower inflation result was falling fuel prices and also lower international airfares. You look at the likes of food prices, though, having increased 12% over the last year, and I doubt that households are looking at these numbers and jumping for joy. Indeed, prices for things still rose, they just rose at a slightly slower pace than we had first thought. Of course, all of that, though, is raising questions over where to next for interest rates. The Reserve Bank has done a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to its official cash rate rises. But what's been most interesting so far in 2023 is just how little that's moved actual retail rates. The official cash rate has increased by 100 basis points since the start of the year. If you look at something like a one-year fixed mortgage rate, you're only looking at 20 to 30 basis points of increases. And so it does seem like we're approaching, or we might even be at peak retail interest rates for now. That's certainly a good sign for borrowers.
Do you think they've peaked interest rates, or are you predicting they're going to go higher yet?
I think there is still a chance they could push slightly higher, but I think that there's not a lot of extra runway here for those retail interest rates. Increasingly, we know that the retail banks have got to balance up a few competing trends. On one hand, they've got those higher interest rates from the Reserve Bank themselves. They've got to pay for those. That's the interest rate that they are charged, in effect, on the bank's bank account. But you've also got house sales at their lowest on some measures since the 1980s. If you're a retail bank and you keep putting those interest rates higher and higher, you're not going to be doing nearly as much business. That's not nearly as much money coming in the front door. And so I think what you're seeing is that the retail banks are having to think a lot more about trying to hold some of those increases back, having to absorb some of those official cash rate increases so that they can continue lending out to households, so that they're not having to push quite as many people to the brink with higher and higher mortgage pressure. I think that's probably healthy. What we're seeing is that people are struggling already with their mortgages in some regards, and with the banks having to be more competitive, I think you could well see effectively the banks are coming to the party to keep that part of mortgage lending, that part of the housing market alive. That means that there is at least less pressure than otherwise for a lot of mortgage holders at the moment.
Yeah, certainly is a balancing act. All right, a little bit of a change in direction now. They've changed their citizenship policy. I mean, this has got to be good news for Kiwis, really, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely, especially given this is the 40th anniversary in 2023 of our closer economic relations policy between New Zealand and Australia. The Aussies are a core part of New Zealand's interactions globally. They are our nearest and dearest, our sort of favourite cousin, and also our greatest sporting rivalry. But when we look at the economics of this, having those opportunities for Kiwis to get citizenship really rights a wrong that was created nearly 2 decades ago, and ensures that New Zealanders over in Australia who are paying their taxes get a lot more of the ability to interact in society like other people do. Realistically, I think that the question then becomes, what does that do to migration? We know that migration already from New Zealanders to Australia had been picking up. For the 5 years before COVID-19, on average, you're seeing a net 3,000 New Zealanders more move to Australia than coming back the other way. That's since increased to 10,000 since the borders have reopened, but it's nowhere near the 30,000 net outflow that we saw at points in previous New Zealand-Australia trans-Tasman relationships.
Do you think that it's ultimately this change in citizenship is going to increase the migration significantly?
I think there's a risk that we could see a greater level of migration, but more importantly, I think that this change probably just leaves a lot more New Zealanders in Australia who won't be looking to come home quite as much. I don't know if it moves the dial considerably for Kiwis wanting to move over to Australia. There's already a lot of reasons that people have been considering doing so. Our analysis shows that you can earn around $200 a week New Zealand more if you're in Australia than if you're here. But of course, if that was the case for everyone, there wouldn't be anyone left in New Zealand. There's obviously reasons that a lot of us, 5 million of us, stick around here in our own country. So I think there's more opportunity to keep people in Australia. I don't think you'd see a massive exodus all of a sudden over to Oz, but very much there is a risk, I think, that a few more people will look at these opportunities and go, maybe that's me for the next few years.
Let's hope so, particularly with our nurses and teachers. We need to keep as many of them here as we possibly can. Thank you for your time this morning, Brad. That's Infometrics Principal Economist Brad Olsen.